Welcome to today's office hours presentation on limited English proficiency and the language access plan. Next slide, please. As part of today's session, we will be providing an overview of the limited English proficiency or LEP and language access plan or LAP requirements. But before we dive into that, we want to take a moment to highlight the importance of language access since it is critical to ensuring that LEP individuals have meaningful access to HUD-funded programs. Por ejemplo, si yo soy una agencia que está implementando un programa de servicios de emergencia para personas sin hogar y todos los recursos y documentos están en un idioma que no entiendo, sería muy difícil participar en ese programa. So for those of you that didn't understand that, imagine for a second that all correspondence and documentation was in a language that you didn't understand. And that is the type of obstacle that we are trying to be cognizant of and take steps to overcome. So throughout this presentation, we ask that you do your best to place yourself in the shoes of an LEP individual and think about the significant barriers that they may face when trying to access your HUD-funded programs and services if language assistance services are not provided. Next slide, please. So to ensure that we all have a common understanding of what limited English proficiency or LEP is, we've defined it on this slide, which is people with limited English proficiency are those whose proficiency in speaking, reading, writing, or understanding English is such that it would deny or limit their ability to meaningfully access HUD-funded programs and activities if language assistance services were not provided. And we've intentionally underlined key parts of this definition because there's kind of two important pieces. The first being denying or limiting their ability to meaningfully access your ESG or ESG-CV activities. But the second component, which is more critical, is how we resolve that limit in their ability to access these programs, which is via the provision of language assistance services. And so it's being cognizant of what those barriers are and what you can do to overcome them, specifically as it relates to language. Next slide, please. So now that we know who LEP persons are, what is it that you're required to do? How is it that you're going to overcome this obstacle? Specifically, HCD's policy is that all subrecipients must develop a language access plan or LAP that outlines the measures to be taken to ensure meaningful access to HUD-assisted programs such as ESG or ESG-CV by people with limited English proficiency. And just for clarification, the LEP requirements, even though we're discussing ESG and ESG-CV, actually apply to all federally assisted programs pursuant to Executive Order 13166, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and in accordance with HUD's final guidance. The executive order and HUD's final guidance are hyperlinked here. So once you're able to access these materials, you'll be able to gain access to those documents directly. In addition, we've included a screenshot of California HCD's ESG Limited English Proficiency Guide, which is available on their website. And this would be a useful resource for any subrecipients that want additional information on kind of the background, the purpose, the policy, as well as step-by-step guidance on how to develop your language access plan, which we'll be discussing during our presentation today as well. Next slide, please. So given that HCD's policy requires subrecipients to develop an LAP, some of you may be asking, well, what is an LAP and how do I develop this plan? So for starters, definition is a language access plan is a plan for providing language access services to LEP individuals. In other words, that second half of the LEP definition, which was if language services were not provided, that is precisely what the LAP is. It's what is it that you're going to do to overcome this language obstacle. Some key steps in developing the LAP include conducting the four-factor analysis, identifying the language services needed, developing a plan for providing those services, and then implementing and monitoring that plan. To kind of simplify this process, we've included a graphic at the top, which lays out the LAP process into three main phases. So starting with the four-factor analysis, then moving on to the language access plan, and then finally monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of that plan. And so throughout the remainder of this presentation, we'll go through each of those phases. We'll outline steps that are needed to complete said phase, and then we'll provide you with some tips and best practices that you may want to take into consideration as you go through these exercises yourself. Next slide, please. So the first phase of the LAP process is to conduct the four-factor analysis. As the name indicates, there are 4 steps involved. So for factor 1, you will identify whether your service area contains an LEP population that exceeds the 1,000 person or 5% safe harbor threshold. So to start, we've provided you with a tip here, which is to start with the American Community Survey or ACS data set that provides information on the 4 major language groups. And the 4 major language groups in the data set are Spanish, Indo-European languages, Asian and Pacific Islander languages, as well as other languages. And for this first step, which is a little bit more broad, we recommend that you utilize a 5-year period data set from ACS table S1601, languages spoken at home. Again, this is going to be very broad and categorize the population in a service area by those 4 major language groups. If any of those 4 major language classifications exceed the safe harbor threshold, so if in your service area there's more than 1,000 Spanish speakers, or more than 5% of the people in that service area speak Asian and Pacific Islander languages, then further review is going to be required to determine the specific languages and or dialects that will require the provision of language assistance services. And so you always want to start broad and then narrow down if it's necessary. So if you have identified that one of those 4 major language classifications exceed that safe harbor threshold, such as Asian and Pacific Islander languages, that's very broad and doesn't give you enough detail to determine, well, which Asian or Pacific Islander language do I need to translate my documents into? And so at this stage, you would then utilize, again, a 5-year period data set. But instead of using the previous table, you're going to use ACS table B16001, languages spoken at home by ability to speak English for populations 5 years and older. And then that will be able to narrow down the specific Asian or Pacific Islander languages. So it'll narrow it down from Asian to something like Chinese or Japanese. That data set is actually incredibly useful. It even breaks it down from Chinese into the dialects such as Mandarin or Cantonese. But ultimately, the goal during this step is to, as I said, start broad and then narrow down the results to identify the languages within your service area that exceed the safe harbor threshold. Next slide, please. So this slide contains screenshots of HCD's LEP guide. The screenshot on the top left is a sample table that you all can utilize to identify the languages spoken in your service area, and then easily demonstrate which languages exceed that safe harbor threshold of 1,000 persons or 5%. And so it'll list English, Spanish, Indo-European, Asian Pacific Islander, and then other languages. And so in the numbers column, you'll enter the number of people in that service area that predominantly speak those languages based on that ACS table. And then to calculate the percentages, you'll obviously sum up the numbers column and then divide the number of Spanish speakers by the total number of people in that service area to figure out what that percentage is. If in the numbers column you have a number that's greater than 1,000, you know that you've triggered or exceeded that safe harbor threshold. If in the percent column you have a number that's equal to or greater than 5%, then you know, once again, you have triggered that safe harbor threshold. And so to figure out what you need to do in those cases, the screenshot on the bottom right is an example of recommended language assistance services based on the number or percentage of people in that service area that speak another language. So if more than 1,000 individuals of the eligible population in the service area or among current beneficiaries speak a different language, it is recommended that you translate all of the vital documents. Likewise, if more than 5% of the eligible population are beneficiaries and are greater than 50 in number, you would again translate those vital documents. And then if it's greater than 5% of the eligible population or beneficiaries and 50 or less, you'll at least want to translate the written notice of rights to receive free oral interpretation of documents. And so you'll notice that there's kind of a gradient that you're working on based on the number and percentage of LEP individuals within your service area. And that really informs what types of language assistance services you'll be providing. Next slide, please. So for factor 2, you will assess the frequency and extent to which your program engages with or provides services to LEP individuals. And a tip here is to consider whether your activities provide direct client assistance based on the type of activity or activity component. So if we're thinking about ESG and ESGCV, you don't want to think about ESG and ESGCV as a whole. You narrow it down to street outreach, HMIS, admin, emergency shelter, and so forth. And then also assess the frequency of public contact for each one of those different activity components. So as an example, with street outreach, that level of contact is likely daily, if not weekly, versus admin, it may be less frequent, such as monthly or quarterly. And you may even have activity components such as HMIS, where you're never really coming into direct contact with the client. And so that level of frequency is never. But the only way that you can really map all of that out is to get into the granular level of your activity components and go through that exercise yourself. Next slide, please. And so again, we've included a screenshot of HCD's LEP guide. This is an example that has been pre-populated, but we do recommend that your agency go through this exercise to ensure it's actually reflective of your ESG and ESGCV program. And so in this table, There's 3 columns starting with program component, whether or not direct client assistance is provided through that activity component, and then the frequency of public contact by each one of those activity components. So with street outreach, uh, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and administration, um, based on this exercise, it was determined that there is direct client assistance being provided for each of those 4 activity components. The only one in which direct client assistance is not being provided is HMIS. So then the next level or the next tier is to determine the frequency of public contact. And so for street outreach and emergency shelter, in this example, it was determined that that contact is occurring on a daily basis versus for rapid rehousing and homeless prevention, that may be occurring bi-monthly, whereas administration is really only occurring, once a month, and then HMIS is never really occurring. And so this is super important to take into consideration because it will impact where you decide to allocate certain resources and what types of services you decide, language assistance services you decide to implement within each one of these activity components. Next slide, please. For factor 3, you will evaluate the impact to LEP persons' ability to meaningfully access the program benefits, absent the provision of language assistance measures. And so a few tips here is, as we kind of started the presentation today, we talked about putting yourself in the shoes of an LEP beneficiary. And so you really want to think through the whole process that they may be going through. So how did they find out about the program? Did they read it in a newspaper? Which newspaper? Did they find out about it on social media? Did they hear about it through word of mouth? Getting those data points is super important so that you understand how certain populations are engaging with your content and becoming aware of your programs and services. Another question that you'll definitely want to consider is, what is the intake process and that they would have to go through? So is there an application that they need to fill out? Is there documentation that they need to provide? And do you have those documents or applications in Spanish or in another language that is spoken within your service area, so that they can access that program? Again, when we started this presentation, I blurted out some things in Spanish and asked you to imagine if all of the documents and correspondence were in a language that you didn't understand, how difficult would it be for you to access that program? And so this is that same exercise. And lastly, if it goes beyond an application or notifications, what other forms and documents would they need to complete in order to be accepted into the program and be able to receive the same benefits as any other individual that has been, determined to be eligible and participate in the program? Next slide, please. So again, we have a screenshot of HCD's LEP guide. And in this one, it's kind of laying out all of the benefits for each one of the activity components that your agency is implementing. And so this one we left blank because it's really subject to change based on the subrecipient and their program design. As we've all experienced, it's not uncommon for subrecipients to focus their ESG and ESGCV resources on a few activity components rather than all of them. And so you may want to narrow down your list to just have the specific activity components that you are implementing and list out the specific benefits that your beneficiaries or clientele gain as a result of the implementation of those activity components. And then once you've identified those benefits and the process by which they access those benefits, you'll want to determine what the negative impact is absent those LEP services. And that is really, I think, kind of how you put that thought exercise onto paper. And then you become aware of, oh, we are really limiting or denying a certain population access to our programs. And so that, I think, helps you understand the importance of the language assistance services that you may need to provide to ensure that everyone in your service area is able to benefit from these programs. Next slide, please. And so the fourth and final factor, in this step, you'll calculate the staffing and financial resources available compared to the cost of translating vital documents or providing interpretation services. And so vital documents are those that contain critical information for obtaining and or maintaining meaningful access to ESG and ESGCV services and benefits. And some examples of those documents may include, but are not limited to, outreach materials, applications, consent and complaint forms, notices of participant rights and responsibilities, notices of denial, loss or decrease in benefits or services, disciplinary notices, hearing notices, legal notices, leases and tenant rules, as well as notices advising LEP persons of the availability of free language services. And again, this list is inclusive, but you will want to tailor this list of vital documents to the specific activity component that you're implementing. So if you have a street outreach program, you likely won't need a lease or a rent type of agreement in the specified language, because that has nothing to do with street outreach. And so the idea here is to make sure that you're identifying specific documents that you'll need for each activity component, so that when you get into the language access plan phase, which is next, you can really utilize your resources in a more focused and efficient manner. There are a lot of questions around, limited resources that you may have available, whether it's staffing or financial, and what your options are. And so the availability of, both financial and staffing resources may limit your ability to provide language services. And that is totally okay. Because at that point, reasonable steps may no longer be reasonable when the cost imposed substantially exceeds the benefits. But if, as a subrecipient, you want to make the case that you're not able to address, the needs of the LEP population in your service area, you're going to need to document why providing, these language assistance services constitutes an undue administrative or financial burden. And so examples of that documentation may include a comparison of, the quote or estimated cost of translation and interpretation services compared to what your organization's operating budget is. If you're unable to meet, your obligation to provide services to LEP populations, you're also going to want to document how you're collaborating and partnering with other agencies in your area or your jurisdiction to be able to provide those necessary language services to your clients and beneficiaries. And in addition to that, you can utilize your ESG or ESGCV funds to cover the cost of LEP services, so long as you're able to document that, you paid for translation services of a notice for ESG, or you paid for translation services for an ESG CV rapid rehousing application. And so just being able to connect those dots would make it an allowable and allocable cost to the program, provided that it's also reasonable, which would be determined through your procurement process. Next slide, please. And so again, we've provided a couple screenshots from HCD's LEP guide. The image on the top left is a way that you can kind of map out what your staffing resources are in-house. And again, you'll want to do that based on the activity components that you're implementing, especially because generally for a rapid rehousing program, you'll have a rapid rehousing case manager or team that's dedicated to carrying out that activity component specifically. And so as part of that exercise, you'll want to determine, are there any staff members that speak other languages that are bilingual or multilingual? What languages do they speak? Maybe even when are they in the office? What is their schedule? Their contact information, so that you can figure out what staffing, in-house staffing resources you can already leverage to maybe make some inroads into addressing the language access plan without having to pay an external person or persons to provide these services on your behalf. Then the screenshot on the bottom right is kind of a full map, and this is an example. It's not fully fleshed out, but it's just to really get you all to think about the various documents that would be critical for each one of your activity components. And again, this is super important so that you're not translating rental assistance agreement if you're only implementing a street outreach and administration activity. And so the only way that you can really see that is by mapping out the list of vital documents that are needed for each one of those specific activity components, so that if you decide to get a quote from a translator or an interpreter, you can say, I need 4 applications translated, I need marketing materials for 4 programs translated, and so forth. And so this will allow you to get a more accurate quote and discern what that costs to translate those vital documents will be, and compare that to, well, if we have a staff member that speaks one of those languages in-house, maybe we have them translate some of those vital documents. If there's a language that's identified as triggering that safe harbor threshold, but you don't have a staff member that speaks that language, then maybe you kind of offshore that and see if somebody else can translate those documents on your behalf. Next slide, please. So now that we have finished the first phase, we'll be able to move on to the next phase, which is to develop the language access plan. And in this phase, there are 2 steps. So you'll determine the language assistance services, and then you'll devise a plan for providing said services. But in this first step, which is determining the language assistance services, you will utilize the results from the 4-factor analysis to then determine the language assistance services that are most relevant and necessary. And again, there's a lot of variables and nuances that you'll want to consider, such as your in-house resources that are available, as well as what activity components you're implementing, as well as the key vital documents that are required for each one of those specific activity components. And so that's precisely why you want to start phase 1 or your 4-factor analysis, because it'll make developing or identifying the necessary language assistance services much easier. And so some examples of language assistance services that you may want to consider is having an LAP coordinator for your agency. You could even narrow that down to say we have an LAP coordinator for each one of the eligible activity components. You could procure for interpretation services, translation services of those vital documents. You could try and figure out what media of general circulation non-English speakers are engaging with, and make sure that you're publishing or broadcasting those translated materials via those mediums of general circulation. So if you've got a predominant Spanish speaking population, and this is just an example, they're likely not watching an English-based news outlet. So maybe you reach out to an Univision, or you figure out what newspaper is published in Spanish in your jurisdiction or within your service area, and publish all of your notices that are in that language through that media of general circulation, since those speakers, let's say if you have a predominant Spanish speaking population, are likely not going to pick up a newspaper that is traditionally published in English. Another example is to offer language assistance services at no cost to the LAP individual. So just making sure that they're aware that if they need an interpreter, it's free for them. And then of course, staff training, and making sure that your staff is up to speed on the characteristics of your community, the languages that are spoken in your community, as well as what it is that your language access plan states. So if they are at the counter and they have somebody come in, what are the appropriate steps that they should take in the event that they come into contact with a client that doesn't speak English? Next slide, please. I think we need one more. Yep. So then the second step of the language access plan is to develop a plan for providing those services that you identified in the previous step. So if you recall, in the previous step, we said, hey, we want an LAP coordinator. In this step, you're really going to outline those responsibilities. So you're going to say the LAP coordinator is responsible for ensuring applicable and relevant LAP services are conducted. So not only are they kind of in charge of the LAP, but making sure that if you have interpreter services, that they're hired and that they're made available. If you're hiring a translator, making sure that they're the ones responsible for getting all of those vital documents translated in a timely fashion. If you all decide to have an interpreter, you'll want to detail who and when the interpreter is available to provide those services. If you're going to be hiring a translator, again, you want to identify which vital documents will be translated and those that will be completed on an as-needed basis. So again, this is kind of leveling out what are your existing resources and capacity, what's absolutely needed, and then what's a nice to have. And then if you have limited resources, maybe starting off with these are absolutely required. And then the nice to have, if you have additional resources at your disposal, you can start kind of translating some of those documents as time permits or on an as needed basis. And then when non-English media of general circulation, when it'll be utilized for publications, and making sure you have a point of contact there, when and where to outreach to LAP populations will occur, and then when and where staff training on LAP and LAP requirements will occur. And so it's not just a one-time event, but rather an ongoing process. As you know, you may be onboarding new staff, and so making sure that those new staff members are aware of the language access plan, the services that you're providing, and communities change over time, and so making sure that the four-factor analysis that you completed maybe a few years ago is still relevant and reflective of the characteristics of your community. And if the characteristics and languages spoken in your service area have changed, making sure that your staff are also up to date on those changes. If there's new services that you're providing, making sure that your staff are aware of that, so that they can better serve your clients and your beneficiaries. Next slide, please. And so the third and final phase is to monitor and evaluate the LAP. And so in this phase, there are two steps. The first is monitor, the second is evaluate. During this first step, you'll monitor the language access services and identify any common challenges. So some examples of things that you may want to be monitoring for. If you hire someone to provide interpretation services, you may want to monitor, the age of that interpreter, their certification status, as well as their relation to LAP persons. The important piece, I think, is definitely their certification status and whether or not they're actually qualified to be interpreters. And there is an element of the relationship and trust that people have to LAP persons. And so if I were hired to go into a predominantly Asian or Indian community to speak Mandarin or an Indian language, there may be a trust factor that means they don't utilize these interpretation services. And that's not to say that you always have to hire someone that has that direct relationship to LAP persons, but it's something that you want to monitor for and be mindful of and assess whether or not that is a factor that's deterring people from utilizing those services. If you hire somebody to provide translation services, you want to be monitoring for the quality, responsiveness, and understandability of those documents that were translated. So if you're noticing that a lot of people are coming in and asking questions about what does this mean, it doesn't make sense to me, then it may kind of raise some challenges, and you may want to kind of assess, is that due to the quality of the translation? And if so, is it worth exploring, potential other translators, or, kind of getting to the root of why somebody may not have understood the key documents that are necessary to participate in the program. Vital documents, again, it's kind of tied to that translation services, so the quality and understanding and whether or not people are able to successfully and meaningfully access your programs through the use of those translated vital documents. And then last is monitoring your own staff, making sure that there is an awareness and sensitivity to LAP persons' needs, as well as an awareness of the protocols. So if they come into contact with an LAP individual and they don't speak the language that beneficiary speaks, do they know what to do to address that situation? Do they know who they can refer them to, or how they can make sure that they are provided the necessary assistance to be able to meaningfully access and participate in the program and benefit from any one of your activity components that you're implementing. Next slide, please. The final phase or step of the monitoring and evaluation phase is to evaluate, obviously. And during this step, you will review and update your language access plan to ensure compliance with all requirements. And so during this step, you can really evaluate the quality as well as the effectiveness of the language access services, utilizing specific and measurable metrics, such as changes in the language characteristics of a local population. It might have been that 5 years ago, you had a predominantly Spanish-speaking population, but as it stands today, maybe the characteristics of your service area have changed such that there's a predominant Chinese-speaking population. So being aware of that, updating your four-factor analysis, and then updating your language access plan to reflect, oh, well, now we're also providing, language assistance services or translating documents into this additional language. You'll maybe want to track the number of LEP individuals that are served by language category. And so if you're noticing, in the four-factor analysis, it said you had 50% population of Spanish speakers, but you're noticing that, in terms of people that are applying, there's only 2% Spanish speakers and 50% Japanese speakers. Number one, you'll probably want to say, hey, we should probably translate these documents into Japanese if we haven't done so already. But number two is that's probably giving you some insight into the lack of effectiveness of your outreach to the Spanish-speaking population. And so there's kind of two results just from that one metric that allow you to better improve on those services and increase accessibility to your programs. And then last but not least is the quality of those services that are provided. So kind of measuring whether or not those translation or interpretation services are effective, they're reaching the intended population, and resulting in more folks being able to access and benefit from your ESG or ESGCV programs. Next slide, please. And so we appreciate you participating in today's LEP presentation. As a friendly reminder, please refer to HCD's LEP guide, which is available on their website for additional guidance. And please do not hesitate to reach out to your grant administrator or representative if you have any specific questions.